Hello and welcome to another episode of Military HF Radio. Today's episode, number 2, is Military HF History. Just looking back at the episode pipeline, we are now at episode 2, Military HF History. In the previous episode 1, we covered RF theory. We still have another set of episodes coming up. I'm getting those out as fast as possible. Thank you all for your patience over the last couple of months while I had some other things going on, but I hope you're going to enjoy today's episode. Today we'll be looking at military tactical radios, predominantly within the Army, from pre-World War I, World War I, the interwar years, World War II, Korean War, the Penatomic Army, Vietnam War, and what I'll just classify as post-Vietnam. For those of you that are retired Navy, Air Force, other services that have your particular types of HF radios within ships or aircraft, I unfortunately will not be covering those. And in addition, those that may have served in the Vietnam War and had used the popular Collins S-line equipment, operating Mars stations, I will not be covering that radio. And if you are international, I unfortunately will not be covering radios like Codan or Barrett, just because I am going through just a strict run through of military tactical radios, and again predominantly in the Army. I would love to expand this to a history channel type level of history into HF radio, but again, my time is limited. But I'm definitely excited to talk to you here today about these radios through the years. Here's just a couple of them that you may have heard about, or if you haven't, then here they are. You have the BC-312 at the top, 19 Mark II, which was widely disseminated out to the Soviet forces during World War II in the Lend-Lease Act. A lot of those would be used within their tanks. The RBB, the R392, the KWM-2 Collins radio, which used heavily within Mars stations, particularly around the Vietnam War era. And then the 30S1, which is actually the matching around kilowatt, 2 kilowatt amplifier that goes with that. So World War I and pre-World War I HF radio development. We have the Clark Portable Army set here in 1906. These are spark gap radio telegraphy sets. And so the manner and means to which you actually produce what you could say is a continuous wave was really a spark that would transmit at a certain frequency. By the early 1920s, these were banned and went to the more modern technology and how to transmit continuous wave. To the right, you see in 1918 the same portable set being used out there in France, but what you notice is this is not a radio that you take manpack. You do not yet see in vehicles being used mobile at this point, so it is used out in the field fixed. Then in the interwar years, not just the United States, but the Soviet Union, Germany heavily, France, Great Britain, all these countries, Japan included, looked at what they did during World War I and used that time in between World War I and World War II to advance their technology in a number of different areas. Let's just look at HF. Now we see the HF radio being installed in the back of a car. In this case, for the U.S., I think it's the T1 Pontiac Scout car. That if you looked at even today's vehicles, you have the almost same identical setup. You've got an antenna, and the way that antenna is mounted to the vehicle, and then a place for the radio. So in 1933, we had the SCR-189. That included the BC-175 receiver, the BC-176 transmitter that could do CW, a little bit of voice, and it was around 2.2 megahertz to 2.6 megahertz, transmitted almost 8 watts and had a range of about 8 miles. Not the true HF that we would be seeing here in the next couple of years. Then in 1937, the SCR 245, we now have the BC 312 receiver. Very, very popular receiver. If you have those and you see those on eBay, try to pick yourself one up. And I've had a couple friends that have taken these and refurbished them, and they work great. It's paired with the BC 223 transmitter. In AM, you can do CW, voice. And again, these radios at this time were not solid state. They used crystals. These crystals broke, and so you would bring out a kit of spare crystals with you. And they came in these little, not cubes, but more like rectangles. You would, with about 2 prongs on them that you'd stick into the radio, depending on what frequencies you wanted to utilize at that time. Here you see 2 megahertz to 4.5 megahertz, 10 watts. You could probably get range of CW at 45 miles, voice at 20 miles. Let's look about what between us, Great Britain, Canada, but more so Canada and the U.S. We're producing these radios, the 19 Mark II, to specifically the Soviet Union to ensure that they had the communications they needed over the vast expanses of their land to coordinate, communicate the attacks they needed to against the Germans. These radios, when you look at them, the faceplates on them for the different knobs were written both in English and Cyrillic. Now this brings us to World War II HF development. We have quite a bit of equipment that now needs to be housed in a much larger vehicle. And the SCR 299 is credited with, and again, not just credited by anybody, but you have General Dwight Eisenhower saying that it was successful in the reorganization of American forces and final defeat of the Nazis at the Kasserine Pass, which is in North Africa. This mobile communications unit was developed to provide long-range communications during World War II. You saw there in the interwar years that these things were only transmitting around 10 miles, 20 miles. Now we have a lot higher power. We are going higher in frequency, and we're able to get longer ranges. HF, even at this point, folks had a nascent understanding that going higher and higher in frequency could allow you much, much longer distances. But here they're actually getting to those higher frequencies. And when you think higher frequencies, you're thinking, okay, 1 gigahertz, 2 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz. But back then, I mean, even 20 megahertz, 30 megahertz was considered extremely high at that point, which is why it was called high frequency. But you see here that the transmitter output 350 watts. Still using the BC312 receiver, also the BC342. The transmitter, the BC610 or the BC614. These are actually radios that before the war kicked off were actually used by some serious amateur radio operators. And so what the company did to allow these types of radios that would otherwise just stay still in a house or an office is they had to take those vacuum tubes and put little collars, if you will, tighten around them to secure to the chassis so that as this truck is going to be moving, those vacuum tubes could pop out. And so the engineers had to look through about how are you going to secure all the components inside of a radio that you normally market for being still to now being in the back of this vehicle bouncing around. And so they did that. But again, needing to have crystals, spare tubes, because inevitably they will go bad with you. And it's probably no different than even today on certain things that we communicate on out in the field. You need to have spares. So World War II is over. We're now at the Korean War in the 1950s. You can see how everything from the previous slide in the back of that vehicle has now been shrunk down to this. In this case, this is the T195 transmitter and the R392 receiver, which happens to be based on the Collins R390. This is known as the GRC-19 or the Angry 19. And this was actually updated not at the start of the Korean War, which is 1950, but 1951. They realized they needed to update the portable communications equipment. And that huge vehicle that also needed a trailer to have the generator for it, it was just a lot of equipment to bring around. They even tested this to be dropped via parachute if needed. And so this had a auto-tune unit capable of around 100 plus watts of power. This is not a radio. The GRC-106 is not a radio that we would necessarily see on anybody's back. This in fact would either be in a vehicle or base station setup. And this actually was developed in the early 1960s as a replacement to the GRC-19, and it had a heavy auto-tune set that we now have transitioned to the 106. This frequency range limited to 1.5 to 22 megahertz on the GRC-19. This allowed us nearly the full range of HF, going from 2 to 30 megahertz. The other nice thing about the GRC-106 is we now have SSB and solid state construction behind this, as opposed to the GRC-19, which was an AM radio. However, this set was not completely solid state. And so there are 5 vacuum tubes, a lot of them right there towards the end at the finals. Also, it's common around these radios from the 60s and 70s is they used germanium devices, or germanium solid state devices. And also is limited to upper sideband only. For those of you who are not aware, especially for an amateur radio operator that is not familiar with military radios, is almost all these radios, at least the older ones, were only designed to do upper sideband. That meant less circuitry they had to worry about, and also was one less thing that could be a setting in error by the operator. The more advanced military radios of today all can do either or, upper sideband or lower sideband, but almost always default to upper sideband. At first, you just have to set it to lower sideband. But if you are using these radios, there is no setting. It's just, it is upper sideband, unless you take it into continuous wave. Now, this set is not light. It's 120 pounds for the basic set. What will blow your mind is that the GRC-19 is actually 260 pounds. So they're getting better. This particular set was produced by General Dynamics. Let's look at some other radios in the Vietnam era, the PRC-47 and the PRC-70. Radios that are meant to be man-pack-ish and taken out more readily into the field. So the PRC-47, produced by Collins, and can do upper sideband, frequency shift king, and CW. It operates 2 to 12 megahertz. Slightly heavy. It can be characterized as a man-pack, as you see there to the left in that picture. Maybe. At least you can drop it down on the ground there and utilize it. It did have the ability to auto-tune a 15-foot whip antenna. Uses the standard 24 volts DC. For those of you who are unaware, most of our radios do operate off of 24 volts. So if you do want to power one of these up, you need to get a 24 volt power DC power supply, and that's just because a lot of our vehicles are 24 volts. And it actually can be powered by 115 volts AC. It's rated at 100-watt output. The PRC-70, manufactured by Cincinnati Electronics, starting around 1964, can actually operate between 2 and 76 megahertz, can do USB, AM, FM, and CW, and a max power of 40 watts. This is what we would like to consider one of your first true Manpack HF radios, particularly ones that look more like what we have today. Except no digital display. Little selector knobs there to show you which frequency setting per which place of the decimal point you're at. It can also be powered between 20 and 32 volts DC. Pretty interesting voltage range there. And it was designed to bridge the gap between your classic VHF radio of the time during the Vietnam War, your PRC 25s and 77s, and then your HF PRC 47 that you see there on the left. It bridged between those two worlds. And that's not unlike what we even have today. We definitely have certain radios where they kind of bridge that gap a little bit between either a pure VHF environment or an HF environment. The improved HF radio sets that it says 70s, 80s, and 90s, but sometimes you will see this still running around the Army for whatever reason. Still a fantastic radio. The base Manpack configuration, consider the PRC 104, can do 2 to 30 megahertz, AM or SSB. Output of 20 watts seems to be the standard even today for your Manpack HF radio, because just the battery size, the battery life, you're just looking at only being able to get 20 watts RF output on battery. Now it says 30 plus miles. I will emphasize the plus. You can get a long distance, and although this isn't digital at this point, we're still analog, you can still get much further than 30 miles. When you can take the same radio or the previous radio we were talking about in the previous slide there, the PRC-70, potentially you can then put those little modularized radios into larger base station apparatuses and then come up with a GRC 213, and then that is 20 watts. But then if you also have a amplifier with that, like in the case of the GRC 193 vehicle mount, you can either have a 100 or 400 watt amplifier module, and you can considerably boost your power. And it says range 50 to 200 miles, but if you are outputting 400 watts, you're getting much further than that, trust me. So the PRC 138, this is truly a special radio, because at this point we have a radio to which even today not just looks the same, but functions almost no differently in terms of the different modulation schemes, the digitization of voice. It all really came to fruition with this radio. Like I said earlier, you have radios that can bridge the gap between either a purely HF environment or a VHF environment, and this radio is no different. Although it doesn't necessarily do the full range of the VHF, let's say our Singars radios, it can do pretty decent job of covering almost most of them. It is a 20 watt output radio. When you switch over to the VHF range, it drops down to 10 watts, and it weighs around 4.5 kilograms, and that's without batteries, by the way. It incorporates a lot of what we see today. If you see that on the knob selector switch, you see SSB, you see HOP, you see ALE, automatic link establishment, to which you can preload frequencies in as many radios as you potentially need for your local net. And then you can push a button, and then the radio will start sounding, basically sending test data to then see if other radios can hear it, and then the other radios will report back the signal strength, and then they can auto-negotiate, if you will, what frequency per the time of the day is the best to communicate on. That takes a lot of the guesswork out of telling everybody, hey, at 1900, we all need to switch over to this particular frequency because as the sun sets, as we learned back in episode 1, that we are going to drop out the layers, the D, E, and then F1, F2 combined. So we need to start changing frequencies from what we were using during the day. Okay, fair enough. So automatic link establishment comes into full fruition also with this radio. We can also digitize our voice, and with that, do a much easier job of encrypting it if we need to. So just a lot of interesting advances with this particular radio. The PRC 150, this is essentially the radio that is in full force across almost every unit. It happens to be produced by Harris, and you see the relevant data on the radio to the right. Again, 20 watts max. Can also be selected between 1, 5, or 20. Sensitivity is fairly good for a radio you can take out into the field. In fact, the newer radios today don't improve too much on that sensitivity. The IF rejection and image rejection are decent for, again, a tactical radio you take out into the field. The one thing you don't do with these radios is go on the amateur radio bands and start flipping through frequencies. It doesn't have a knob. Okay, so you gotta punch in the frequency that you're actually going to use. This is not something fun necessarily to use on a field day. Have I used one of these radios on amateur radio bands with my amateur radio license? Yes. In order to ensure that I could test my setup, I moved over and used the radio for that. Totally fine. So that's one advantage of getting an amateur radio license, by the way. But yeah, I wasn't able to just flip through the band looking for somebody. I had to literally just punch in a frequency, call CQ, and see who'd call back. This radio is a lot more advanced than the PRC 138. You can see there's a data connector, an accessory connector, and you have a fill port and your antenna port there to the right. Also, notice off to the right, there's a little stub there, a black stub. That's for your ground. Again, cognizant that it's important to ground these radios when using HF. It definitely helps in system performance. I like to bring up this slide, particularly if you are watching this, you're in the military, and you've always wondered why radios look the same but are not referred or as the same or have a different designation on it. The radio to the left, the PRC 158, is actually designated as the RT, again, receiver transmitter 1694 Delta. That is the HF radio, but also fielded to the Army and other services is this Harris PRC 117 Foxtrot, which is not an HF radio. It is a VHF, UHF, SATCOM radio. Okay, not an HF radio. And it is RT 1796. They look almost identical. Pretty good streamlining of your assembly line when you have two very similar chassis. It makes it very interesting for monthly inventories because somebody will inevitably come up to you and say that you have 11 PRC 117s and no PRC 150s. And then you have to go through and figure out, oh, now we have, 5 of one and 6 of the other. Well, what's the difference? Let me take a moment, let you figure that out real quick. If you can see at the center of both of the radios, above the selector switch for what mode of operation you want to be in, the HF radio has a fill port, whereas the PRC 117 Fox has a port for the VHF antenna. So that's the difference. There are actually a couple of other notable ones, but that's the first one to have somebody learn first so that they can quickly figure out that that is not the radio they think it is. What about past the 2000s? What about the 2010s and beyond? Well, there's the PRC 160, and there's other radios out there as well. Almost the same. I say almost. A lot of these newer radios and I want to kind of press beyond just the PRC 160, is everybody wants to push more data, whereas the PRC 150 class of radios can maybe push at most 9.6 kilobits per second. The PRC 160 and other wideband, again I say RF spectrum wideband radios, can push higher speeds because they're using more bandwidth, past your standard 3 kilohertz SSB transmission. These wideband radios can maybe push around 48 to more kilobits per second. Notice I didn't say 1 megabit per second or higher. Again, HF does not have a lot of bandwidth available for folks to use. It's no different in the military because we got to share with everybody else. And so 48 kilobits per second is at least a lot better. And maybe people want to operate that way, and that's great. However, if a lot more people want to operate in the same space or a range of frequencies, you're going to have less wideband channels available because obviously each one is wider bandwidth. Something to think about. Can you get what you need done with just 9.6 kilobits per second of text data being passed over these than you would with 48 kilobits per second, and allow you to have a lot more users in that same space? Something to think about. So thank you for watching. I'll try to keep this a little short. I want to talk now on HF NIVIS in the next episode, episode 3, to get you clued in more on near vertical incident skywave and its benefits. So thank you for watching. If you like this series, please subscribe, and you'll be updated on any more of the episodes coming up onto YouTube. Again, thank you for watching.